On a bitter winter night, a lonely old man, Henry, finds a stray mother dog and her two puppies shivering at his door, seeking shelter from the cold. What begins as a reluctant act of kindness blossoms into a bond that heals his grief and fills his final days with love. After his peaceful passing, the village embraces the dogs who live by his grave, a testament to their unbreakable connection. This heartwarming tale reveals how love can mend a broken spirit and leave a legacy that warms a community forever. Welcome to Critters.planet, where the magic of human-animal and animal-animal bonds comes to life through heartfelt stories. From foxes and wolves to cats and dogs, we explore the extraordinary connections that inspire, heal, and unite across species. Join us for tales of love, loyalty, and the wild wonder of critters everywhere. The wind howled like a mourner's wail. Outside Henry Grayson's cottage, a small weathered shack perched on the edge of Willow Hollow, where the fields met the woods in a tangle of shadow and frost. It was late December, and the night pressed against the windows with a cold so sharp it seemed to claw its way through the glass. Snow fell in heavy sheets, blanketing the world in white, muffling all but the wind's relentless cry. Inside, the fire sputtered in the hearth, a frail glow that barely reached the corners of the room, leaving the walls cloaked in gloom. Henry sat slumped in his old armchair, its leather cracked and faded like his own skin, staring into the flames, as if they held answers he'd long stopped seeking. He was 78, though the years felt heavier than that, each one a stone piled onto his chest since Martha, his wife of 50 years, had slipped away. A year ago, almost to the day, she'd taken her last breath in this very room, her hand limp in his, her smile faint but warm even as the cancer stole her. "Don't let the quiet eat you, Henry," she'd whispered, her voice a thread he'd clung to until it snapped. But the quiet had come anyway, a beast that gnawed at him day and night, filling the cottage with echoes of her laughter, her humming, her soft steps on the creaking floor. Now there was only him and the silence thick and suffocating, broken only by the fire's occasional pop and the wind's mournful song. Henry's hands rested on his knees, gnarled and trembling, the knuckles swollen from years of hauling wood and tending the land. He wore the same sweater he'd worn yesterday, and the day before that. A grey wool thing Martha had knitted, its sleeves frayed but still carrying the faint scent of her lavender soap. He hadn't washed it, couldn't bear to, just as he couldn't bear to move her shawl from the back of the chair across the room, where it hung like a ghost, watching him waste away. His hair, once a thick chestnut, was now a wispy white, falling into eyes that were dull and sunken, mirrors to a mind unraveling under the weight of grief. The clock on the mantel ticked, a slow, relentless march toward nothing. 8:10. He hadn't eaten since noon, a bowl of soup gone cold on the table beside him, its steam long faded. Food didn't matter anymore, nothing did. The doctor in town had called it depression, scribbled something about pills Henry never picked up. What was the point? Pills couldn't bring Martha back, couldn't fill the hole she'd left. He'd stopped going to the market, stopped answering the neighbors' knocks. Good folk who'd tried at first bringing casseroles and kind words until his silence drove them away. Now it was just him, the cottage and the storm outside, a fitting companion to the storm within. He leaned forward, poking the fire with a stick, the embers flaring briefly before settling back into their weak dance. The wood was running low. He'd have to fetch more from the shed tomorrow if he could muster the will. His breath fogged in the air, a reminder of the cold seeping through the walls, through his bones. He pulled Martha's shawl from the chair and draped it over his shoulders, its softness a cruel comfort against the ache in his chest. "Should have gone with you," he muttered, his voice a rasp barely audible over the wind. He said it often these days, a prayer to no one, a wish he lacked the courage to chase. The wind shifted, slamming against the door with a force that rattled the frame, and Henry flinched, his heart thudding, a rare jolt of life in a body that felt half dead. He stared at the door, its paint peeling in curls, and for a moment he thought he heard something else, something beneath the storm's roar, a trick of the mind, surely. He shook his head, sinking back into the chair, his eyes drifting to the photo on the mantel, him and Martha younger, smiling in a field of daisies, her arm looped through his. The frame was dusty, untouched since she'd gone, but he could still see her face clear as day, those hazel eyes, that crooked grin. "Miss you," he whispered, the words catching in his throat, a sob he wouldn't let free. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced like memories across the room. Martha baking bread, her flour-dusted hands brushing his cheek. Martha laughing as they danced to the radio, her skirt twirling. He closed his eyes, willing the images to stay, but they faded, leaving only the dark, the cold, the weight. His mind churned, a tangle of regret and loss. Should have said more, should have held her longer, should have been enough to keep her here. The stress of it gnawed at him, a relentless ache that blurred days into nights, nights into nothingness. He was drifting, half lost in that fog, when the sound came again, faint but real this time, a scratching, soft and insistent, at the base of the door. Henry's eyes snapped open, his breath hitching. The wind? No. There it was again, accompanied by a whimper, so small it nearly drowned in the storm's fury. He frowned, his brows knitting as he pushed himself up, the chair creaking under his weight. His legs wobbled, stiff from hours of stillness, but he shuffled forward, Martha's shawl slipping to his elbows as he gripped the doorknob. The cold bit at his fingers as he turned it, the wind shoving the door inward with a gust that sent snow swirling across the floor. He squinted into the dark, the storm a white wall beyond the porch, and then he saw them, shapes huddled against the doorstep, trembling in the snow. A dog, thin and soaked, her fur plastered to her frame, and two tiny puppies pressed against her, their eyes barely open, their whimpers lost to the wind. The mother dog looked up at him, her gaze steady despite her shivering, a plea in those deep brown eyes that pierced through the haze of Henry's despair. For a moment, he just stared, the cold seeping into his slippers, the fire's warmth fading, at his back. They were strays, lost, desperate, nothing to do with him, but those eyes, that quiet need, they reached into the hollow where Martha used to be, stirring something he thought was long gone. And as the wind howled, threatening to swallow them whole, Henry felt his heart thud again, a beat of something alive, something that wouldn't let him turn away. The wind roared through the open doorway, a frigid gust that swept snow across the cottage floor and snuffed the fire's frail warmth like a candle pinched out. Henry stood frozen, one hand gripping the doorknob, the other clutching Martha's shawl around his shoulders, his breath fogging in the icy air. The storm was a beast outside, its howl a chorus of chaos, but it was the sight at his feet that stopped him cold. Three trembling shapes huddled against the doorstep, their outlines blurred by the swirling white. A dog, thin and drenched, her ribs stark beneath a coat of matted fur, and two tiny puppies pressed tight against her, their whimpers barely audible over the wind's fury. Henry squinted, his eyes straining against the dark and the snow that stung like needles. The mother dog was a patchwork of brown and black, her ears drooping, her body hunched as if shielding her pups from the world itself. She was small, not much bigger than a fox, but her presence was fierce, a quiet strength in the way she held her ground despite the cold gnawing at her. The puppies were smaller still, no bigger than his hands, their fur slick with wet, their eyes barely cracked open as they shivered against her. One was a mottled grey, the other a soft tan, both so fragile they seemed like they might blow away if the wind tried harder. For a long moment, he just stared, the cold seeping through his slippers, up his legs, into the marrow of his bones. The mother dog looked up at him, her brown eyes catching the faint glow from the dying fire inside. They were deep, those eyes, deep and pleading, not with desperation but with a raw, unspoken need. "Help us," they seemed to say, a silent cry that cut through the storm and landed square in Henry's chest. He felt it like a jolt, thud against the wall of numbness he'd built since Martha's passing, and it startled him, this sudden ache he couldn't name. "Who are you?" he muttered, his voice a rasp lost to the wind as if she might answer. She didn't, of course, just tilted her head, her ears twitching, and let out a soft whine, a sound so small yet so piercing it made his throat tighten. The puppies whimpered, too, their tiny bodies pressing closer to her, seeking warmth she could barely give. Henry's gaze darted from them to the storm beyond, where the snow piled high against the porch, burying the world in white. It was a killing cold out there, merciless, unrelenting, and these strays, they wouldn't last the night, not like this. He stepped back, his hand tightening on the door, ready to shut it, to retreat to his chair and the silence he knew. They weren't his problem. He was too old, too worn out to take on strays, too broken to care for anything that breathed. The fire was nearly gone, the wood scarce, his own strength fading. Let the storm have them, he thought, a flicker of hardness born from exhaustion. But then the mother dog shifted, nudging her puppies closer to the threshold, her nose brushing the snow-dusted floor as if testing the edge of his world. One pup, the grey one, stumbled forward, its paws slipping, and fell against the doorstep with a faint cry. Henry's breath hitched. That cry. It was so small, so helpless. It burrowed into him, past the grief, past the stress, into a place he'd locked away. He saw Martha in his mind, clear as the day she'd found a bird with a broken wing in the yard, cradling it in her hands, her voice soft. "Can't leave the little ones to suffer, Henry." She'd nursed it, fed it, set it free when it could fly again, and here he was staring at these three, their lives hanging by a thread, and he couldn't move, couldn't decide. The wind slammed the door against the wall, a bang that made him flinch, and the mother dog flinched too, her body curling tighter around her pups. She didn't bark, didn't growl, just watched him, her eyes steady, trusting in a way that made his chest ache. Trusting him, this old man who'd given up on trust, on hope, on everything. The tan puppy whimpered again, its head lolling against its mother's side, and Henry felt the cold bite deeper, not just in his bones, but in his soul. He couldn't do it, couldn't shut the door. Not on that sound, not on those eyes. He shuffled forward, his slippers crunching the snow that had blown inside, and knelt, slow and creaky, his knees protesting as he lowered himself. The mother dog didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched, her tail giving a faint twitch, a ghost of a wag. Up close he saw the frost on her whiskers, the way her breath came in shallow puffs, the way her pups clung to her like she was their only shield. "You're a mess," he muttered, his voice gruff but softer now, the hardness cracking. He reached out, hesitant, and her nose brushed his fingers. Cold, wet, alive. The touch jolted him, a spark of warmth against the numbness, and he pulled back, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. The puppies whimpered again, their cries growing weaker, and the mother dog nudged them toward him, a plea he couldn't ignore. Henry's jaw tightened, his mind churning. Let them in, just for tonight, just until the storm passed. He wasn't promising anything, wasn't signing up for more than that. But he couldn't leave them out there, not when they'd found his door, not when they'd looked at him like that. "All right," he rasped, pushing the door wider. "Get in then, quick." He stood, wincing as his back twinged, and stepped aside. The mother dog hesitated, her eyes searching his, then rose, her legs shaky but determined. She scooped the grey pup in her jaws, gentle as a whisper, and nudged the tan one forward, guiding them over the threshold. They stumbled, their paws slipping on the wet floor, and Henry watched, his heart thudding, a slow, heavy beat he hadn't felt in too long. The wind roared one last time as he shut the door, sealing out the storm, sealing in the strays. The cottage was quiet again, save for the faint crackle of the fire and the soft patter of their paws. Henry turned, Martha's shawl slipping to his elbows, and saw them there, three lost souls in his lonely world, shivering, alive, needing him. And as the mother dog looked up at him, her eyes warm with something like gratitude, Henry felt the silence shift, just a little, into something he couldn't yet name. The door thudded shut behind Henry, cutting off the wind's howl with a final, muffled groan, and the cottage fell into a stillness that felt heavier than before. Snow dusted the floor where it had blown in, melting into tiny puddles that gleamed in the firelight, and the air carried a chill that clung to the walls. Henry stood there, his hand still on the knob, Martha's shawl hanging loose around his shoulders, his breath fogging in short, uneven bursts. The mother dog and her two puppies were inside now, their small forms huddled just beyond the threshold, trembling against the worn wooden boards. He'd let them in, against every instinct, every whisper of exhaustion. And now they were here in his space, his silence, his world. He turned, slow and creaky, his slippers scuffing the floor, and looked at them. The mother dog sat upright, her thin frame taut but steady, her brown eyes fixed on him with that same quiet plea he'd seen outside. Her fur was a sodden mess, dripping water onto the boards, and her ribs pressed sharp against her sides, a map of hunger and struggle. The puppies, grey and tan, tiny and frail, pressed against her, their whimpers softening now that the wind couldn't steal them away. They were alive, barely, their little bodies shaking with cold, their eyes half open, trusting her, trusting him. Henry's jaw tightened, his mind a tangle of doubt and gruff resolve. "Don't get comfortable," he muttered, his voice a rasp that barely reached them. "Just till the storm's done. That's it." He didn't mean it, not fully, but saying it made him feel in control, like he could still draw a line between himself and these strays who'd stumbled into his life. He wasn't their keeper, wasn't anyone's anymore. He'd lost that part of himself when Martha went, and he wasn't about to dig it up for a dog and her pups, no matter how pitiful they looked. But the fire was dying. Its embers a faint, red glow that wouldn't last the hour, and the chill in the room was creeping closer. Henry shuffled to the hearth, his knees protesting as he knelt, and tossed in the last log from the basket, a splintered chunk of oak that crackled as it caught. The flames flared, casting light across the cottage, and he glanced back at the trio. They hadn't moved, just sat there watching him, the mother dog's ears twitching at every sound. The puppies shivered harder, their whimpers turning to soft, desperate cries, and Henry felt that ache again, that stubborn tug he couldn't shake. All right, he grumbled, pushing himself up with a groan. He shuffled to the corner where an old blanket lay folded, a faded blue thing Martha had used for picnics, its edges frayed but soft. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the fabric, her memory flickering in the weave. She'd have done this without. A second thought, spread it out, made a nest, cooed over the little ones. He wasn't her, though, wasn't that kind of man anymore. Still, the puppies' cries grew sharper, and the mother dog nudged them closer to the fire, her nose brushing, their backs as if begging him to see. He sighed a heavy, reluctant sound and carried the blanket over, dropping it near the hearth. "There," he said, stepping back. "That's all you're getting." The mother dog tilted her head, her eyes searching his, then rose, her legs wobbly but sure. She nosed the blanket, spreading it with her muzzle, and guided her pups onto it one by one. The grey one stumbled, its paws slipping, and she caught it gently in her jaws, setting it down with a tenderness that made Henry's throat tighten. The tan one followed, curling against its sibling, and she lay beside them, her body a shield around their small forms. The firelight danced over them, warming the damp from their fur, and Henry watched, his hands shoved into his pockets, his heart thudding slow and heavy. They looked better somehow, less like ghosts on his doorstep, more like something real, something alive. The puppies' shivers eased, their whimpers fading to soft sighs, and the mother dog rested her head on her paws, her eyes still on him, steady and warm. He felt it then, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months, a spark of purpose that burned faint but stubborn against the cold in his chest. He turned away, shuffling to the kitchen corner, his slippers dragging. "Crazy old fool," he muttered, rummaging through the cupboard. He found a tin of sardines, something he'd kept for a day he never got around to, and a cracked bowl, its edge chipped from years of use. He pried the tin open, the sharp smell cutting through the air, and dumped the fish into the bowl, his hands trembling more from nerves than age. Food. They needed food, didn't they? He wasn't promising a home, just a night, just enough to keep them breathing till morning. He set the bowl near the blanket, stepping back quick like he might catch something if he lingered. "Eat it or don't," he said, his voice gruff but softer now. The mother dog lifted her head, sniffing the air, and rose, her tail giving a faint wag, the first he'd seen. She nosed the bowl, then licked at the sardines, slow at first, then eager, her hunger breaking through her caution. The puppies stirred, drawn by the scent, and she nudged them forward, guiding them to lap at the oily scraps with tiny, clumsy tongues. Henry stood there, arms crossed, watching them eat. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside, but in here, it was different, quieter, warmer, alive. The mother dog finished licking her chops and looked up at him, her eyes glinting with something like thanks. She lay back down, curling tighter around her pups, and they nestled into her, their bellies full, their breathing steady. Henry's chest ached, not the sharp pain of grief, but something softer, something he couldn't name. He sank into his chair, Martha's shawl slipping to his lap, and stared at them. "Just till the storm's done," he repeated, quieter now, more to himself. But as the fire glowed, casting shadows that danced with the stray's gentle snores, he felt the silence shift, a little less empty, a little less cruel. They were here, needing him, and for tonight that was enough to keep the dark at bay. The fire crackled in the hearth, its glow steady now, casting a warm circle around the cottage that pushed back the shadows and the cold. Henry sat in his armchair, Martha's shawl draped over his knees, his hands still in his lap as he watched the strays settle into the blanket by the fire. The storm outside had softened to a low moan, the snow piling high against the windows, but inside the quiet was different, less oppressive, threaded with the soft snores of the puppies and the mother dog's steady breathing. They'd eaten the sardines, their bellies fuller than they'd been in who knows how long, and now they slept, a small huddle of life in a space that had felt dead for too long. Henry's eyes traced them, his brow furrowed, his mind churning beneath the gruff exterior he clung to. The mother dog lay curled around her pups, her thin frame relaxed for the first time since she'd crossed his threshold. Her fur, still damp in patches, glinted in the firelight, a mix of brown and black that reminded him of the earth after rain, worn but enduring. The puppies nestled into her, their tiny bodies rising and falling, the grey one with its mottled coat, the tan one with its soft, downy fuzz. They weren't just strays anymore, not in this light, not with their warmth seeping into his cottage. They were something more, something he hadn't meant to let in. He shifted, the chair creaking under him, and rubbed his hands together, the calluses rough against his palms. "Can't just keep calling you dog and pups," he muttered, his voice low as if testing the words. Naming them, it felt like a step, a commitment he wasn't sure he wanted to make. But they'd be gone by morning, wouldn't they? The storm would pass, and he'd send them on their way back to wherever strays went. Still, the thought of them leaving nameless gnawed at him, a loose thread he couldn't ignore. The mother dog stirred, lifting her head to meet his gaze. Her brown eyes calm and deep, like still water after a storm. There was a peace in them, a quiet strength that steadied something in him, something he'd lost when Martha's laughter faded. "Mira," he said suddenly, the name slipping out before he could stop it. It meant peace, he remembered, something Martha had said once, reading one of her old books by the fire. It fit her, this dog who'd brought a strange calm into his chaos. "Yeah, Mira," he repeated, softer now, testing it. Her ears twitched and she tilted her head, a faint wag rippling through her tail, as if she approved. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and studied the puppies. The grey one snuffled in its sleep, its paws twitching like it was chasing dreams, and Henry's lips quirked, a ghost of a smile, the first in months. "Lark," he decided, nodding to himself. It suited the little one's spirited sounds, the way its whimpers had turned to chirps as it warmed by the fire. The tan one shifted, its nose burrowing deeper into Mira's fur, and he chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Pip," he said, picturing its tiny, piping cries from the doorstep. Small names for small things, but they stuck, settling into the air like they belonged. "All right then," he muttered, sitting back. "Mira, Lark, and Pip. That's you lot." Naming them made them real. Too real, maybe. But he pushed the thought aside, telling himself it was just for tonight, just until the snow stopped. He wasn't keeping them. He couldn't. But as he watched them sleep, their trust in him a weight he hadn't carried in a year, he felt a pull, a need to do more, to keep that trust alive. He rose, slow and stiff, and shuffled to the kitchen. Corner again, his slippers dragging over the boards. The sardines were gone, but they'd need more. Something to build their strength, something to chase the cold from their bones. He rummaged through the pantry, his hands shaking slightly, and found a jar of broth, chicken, left from a batch Martha had made before she got sick. He pried it open, the savory scent filling the air, and poured it into a pot, setting it on the stove. The flame hissed to life and he stirred, his movements clumsy but deliberate, warming it just enough to take the chill off. While it heated, he grabbed an old towel from a drawer, rough but clean, and carried it to the hearth. "You're a mess," he said to Mira, kneeling beside her with a grunt. She lifted her head, watching him, and he hesitated, then draped the towel over her back, rubbing gently to dry her fur. She didn't flinch, just leaned into his touch, her eyes half closing, and Henry's throat tightened. He moved to the puppies, dabbing at their damp coats, their tiny bodies warm under his hands. Lark squirmed, letting out a sleepy yip, and Pip sighed, nuzzling closer to Mira. "There," he said, his voice gruff but soft. "Better, ain't it?" The broth was ready now, steaming in the pot, and he poured it into a shallow dish, setting it near the blanket. "Don't expect this every night," he warned, but Mira was already up, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. She lapped at it, slow and careful, then nudged Lark and Pip awake, guiding them to the dish. They stumbled over, their tongues darting out, and Henry watched, his chest warming as they drank, their tails wagging faintly. Lark's a quick flicker, Pip's a lazy sway. He sank back into his chair, the fire's heat washing over him, and let out a long breath. The cottage felt different, still quiet, but alive, the silence broken by the soft slurps and the crackle of the flames. Mira finished licking her chops and lay down again, curling around her pups as they settled back into sleep. She looked at him, her eyes glinting with gratitude, and Henry felt that spark again, purpose, small but real, flickering in the dark, of his mind. "Just till morning," he muttered, pulling Martha's shawl tighter, but his voice lacked conviction. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't want to think about it. For now they were here, Mira and her pups, breathing life into his lonely nights, and as the fire burned low, Henry closed his eyes, the ache in his chest a little. Lighter, a little less alone. Morning crept into the cottage with a pale, wintry light, seeping through the snow-crusted windows and painting the walls in soft grays. The storm had quieted overnight, leaving behind a hush that blanketed the world. Outside, but inside, the air hummed with something new. Henry stirred in his armchair, his neck stiff from sleeping upright. Martha's shawl tangled around his arms. The fire had dwindled to embers, its warmth a faint memory, but the blanket by the hearth held a different heat, a living one, where Mira lay curled around Lark and Pip, their small bodies nestled close, their breathing steady and soft. He rubbed his eyes, blinking away the fog of sleep, and looked at them. Mira's ears twitched, her brown eyes opening to meet his, calm and warm as they'd been the night before. Her tail gave a slow wag, a gentle thud against the blanket, and the puppies shifted, Lark letting out a sleepy yip, Pip nuzzling deeper, into her fur. Henry's lips twitched, almost a smile, a reflex he hadn't felt in so long it caught him off guard. "Still here, huh?" he muttered, his voice a rusty grumble, but there was no bite in it, no push to send them out into the snow. The storm was done, he knew that. Could see it in the stillness beyond the glass, the way the wind had settled into silence. He could open the door, shoo them off, go back to his quiet. But as Mira rose, stretching her thin frame with a grace that belied her hunger, and the puppies tumbled after her, their paws slipping on the floor, Henry felt a tug, a stubborn, foolish thing that kept him rooted where he was. They were a mess, these three, all matted fur and clumsy steps, but they were alive, and they were here, and that was something he couldn't unsee. He stood, his joints creaking like the cottage itself, and shuffled to the kitchen corner, his slippers scuffing the boards. "Might as well eat," he said, more to himself than to them, and Mira padded after him, her nose twitching as he rummaged through the pantry. Lark and Pip followed, their tiny barks bouncing off the walls, Lark's sharp and eager, Pip's softer like a little chime. Henry glanced down, and there they were at his feet, looking up with those big, trusting eyes, their tails wagging in uneven rhythms. He huffed, a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd let it, and pulled out a tin of oats, a jar of leftover bacon grease, bits and pieces he hadn't touched in months. The stove hissed as he lit it, warming the oats with a dollop of grease, the smell filling the cottage with a richness that made his own stomach rumble. Mira sat close, her head tilted, watching him work, while Lark pounced at Pip, the two rolling in a tangle of fur and yips. Henry shook his head, his lips quirking again. "You're a handful," he muttered, but he didn't mean it. Not really. He spooned the warm mash into a bowl and set it down, stepping back as Mira guided her pups to it. They dove in, Lark's nose smearing grease across Pip's ear, and Henry watched, his hands in his pockets, a warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. They ate, and then they played. Mira nudged a scrap of rag from the blanket, a torn bit Martha had once used to patch a quilt, and Lark snatched it, darting across the floor with a triumphant bark. Pip chased after, tumbling over his own paws, and Henry found himself leaning forward, his breath catching. As they skidded into his slippers, he bent, slow and careful, and tugged the rag free, tossing it lightly across the room. Lark bolted after it, Pip stumbling behind, and Mira joined in, her tail wagging harder now, a soft woof escaping her as she bounded alongside them. Henry straightened, his hands trembling, not from cold but from something else, something alive. He watched them chase and tumble, their barks and yips filling the cottage with a sound he hadn't heard since Martha's laughter faded. It was chaos, messy, loud, unscripted, and it was beautiful. He sank back into his chair, his eyes stinging, and let it wash over him. The puppies crashed into each other, rolling in a heap, and Mira flopped beside them, panting, her eyes glinting with a joy that mirrored something stirring in him. He didn't notice it at first. The smile. It crept up, small and crooked, pulling at the corners of his mouth as Lark dragged the rag to his feet, dropping it with a proud bark. Henry reached down, his fingers brushing the pup's damp fur, and Lark licked his hand. A quick, warm swipe. That made him chuckle. A real chuckle, low and rough, but there. "You little rascal," he said, his voice softer than he meant it to be. And Pip toddled over, nuzzling his other hand, while Mira watched, her head resting on her paws, her gaze steady and warm. The morning stretched on, and they stayed, following him as he stoked the fire, nudging his legs as he moved to the window to check the snow. He talked to them, gruff at first, then easier, words spilling out he hadn't said in months. "Martha'd have loved you lot," he murmured, stirring more oats, his hands steadier now. "She'd have spoiled you rotten." He paused, the memory sharp but not cutting, and Mira pressed against his knee, her warmth seeping through his trousers, grounding him. By noon the cottage was alive, barks and yips, the clatter of a bowl, the rustle of the blanket as they played. Henry sat again, the shawl in his lap, and smiled, really smiled, the lines of his face softening as Lark climbed onto his feet, Pip chewing at his slipper, Mira resting her head on his shin. The stress, the grief, it was still there, heavy, in his bones, but lighter now, pierced by a glimmer of joy he hadn't thought possible. They'd brought it, these strays, with their messy fur and boundless trust, and as the fire burned bright, Henry felt the silence retreat, just a little, making room for something new. "Just till the snow melts," he said, but his voice was quiet, uncertain, and his hand rested on Mira's head, stroking her fur as the puppies dozed against him. The day wore on, and Henry didn't push them out. Couldn't, not when they looked at him like that, not when they'd brought this light into his dark. For the first time in a year, he wasn't alone, and that was enough to hold him there, smiling into the warmth. The snow lingered outside Henry's cottage, a stubborn blanket that clung to the fields and frosted the windows, but inside, the days began to blur into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. The fire burned steady now, fed by logs Henry hauled from the shed with a vigor he hadn't known he still had, its warmth wrapping the room in a golden glow. Mira, Lark, and Pip had claimed their corner by the hearth, the blue blanket their kingdom, and Henry, despite his gruff mutterings about just till the snow melts, found himself orbiting them, their presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his grief. Mira was the steady one, her brown eyes tracking Henry as he moved through the cottage, her tail wagging softly whenever he passed. She'd taken to sleeping by his chair at night, her head resting on the worn rug close enough that he could reach down and stroke her fur, a habit he'd fallen into without meaning to. Her coat was filling out, the ribs less stark under his fingers, thanks to the meals he scraped together, oats with bacon grease, bits of stale bread softened in broth, whatever he could spare from his meager stores. She'd eat, then nudge, the bowl toward Lark and Pip, her quiet care a mirror to something Henry remembered, something Martha had done for him in their leaner years. Lark and Pip were the chaos, their energy growing with every day they spent warm and fed. Lark, the grey one, was the bolder of the two, his bark sharp and bright as he chased shadows on the walls or pounced on Mira's tail, his paws skidding across the floor. Pip, the tan pup, was softer, his yips a little chime as he toddled after, his brother tumbling into Henry's slippers or chewing at the hem of Martha's shawl when it dangled too close. Henry would huff, tugging it free. Little menace. But his voice carried a warmth he couldn't hide, and more often than not, he'd end up scooping them into his lap, their wriggling bodies a weight that settled the ache in his chest. The mornings became a dance. Henry would rise, stiff but purposeful, and stoke the fire while Mira watched, her tail thumping a steady beat. Lark and Pip would wake, yipping and tumbling over each other, and he'd shuffle to the kitchen, their paws pattering behind him like a tiny parade. He'd warm whatever he could find, sometimes a scrap of meat from a neighbor's rare visit, sometimes just oats, and set it down, watching them eat with a crooked smile. "Slow down, you'll choke," he'd grumble, but his hand would rest on Mira's head, stroking her ears as she guided her pups, her patience a quiet lesson he felt in his bones. Afternoons were for rest. The fire would blaze, the cottage warm against the winter's bite, and Henry would sit with the trio sprawled around him. Mira would lie at his feet, her warmth seeping through his slippers, while Lark and Pip climbed into his lap, their tiny snores a lullaby he hadn't known he needed. He'd stroke their fur, his fingers tracing the lines of their growth, Lark's wiry coat, Pip's soft fluff, and the silence would fill with their breathing, a rhythm that matched his own. The stress, the grief, it didn't vanish, but it softened, the edges blunted by their trust, their nearness. Evenings brought stories. Henry started talking to them, his voice rough at first, hesitant, but growing steadier with each night. He'd sit by the fire, Mira's head on his knee, the puppies dozing against him, and let the words spill out, memories he'd kept locked away since Martha's passing. "She'd have loved you," he'd say, his eyes on the flames. "Always wanted a dog, you know, said they'd keep the place lively." He'd tell them about her, how she'd hum while kneading dough, how she'd dance with him in the kitchen, her skirt twirling, her laughter bright. Mira would listen, her eyes glinting, and Lark would snuffle in his sleep, Pip's tail twitching like he heard it too. One night, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows, and Henry paused, his hand still on Mira's head. "Lost her a year ago," he said, his voice breaking softer than the storm outside. "Thought I'd lost me too." He looked down at them, Mira's steady gaze, the puppy's warmth against his legs, and felt the words catch, a sob he didn't fight. "But you're here, ain't you?" Mira nudged his hand, her nose cold but gentle, and he smiled through the tears, a shaky, real thing that lit the room brighter than the fire. The days turned to weeks, and the bond grew, small, quiet moments stitching them together. Henry found an old ball of yarn in a drawer, Martha's from some half-finished scarf, and tossed it for Lark, who bounded after it with a bark that echoed off the walls. Pip chased too, tumbling into Mira, and Henry laughed, a full, rusty sound that startled him as much as it delighted them. He'd mend the blanket when Pip chewed a hole in it, grumbling but smiling, and Mira would press against him, her tail wagging as if she knew he wasn't really mad. The cottage changed. Less. A tomb, more a home. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with barks and yips, the patter of paws, the rustle of fur against his hands. Henry moved easier, his hands steadier as he chopped wood or stirred broth, his mind clearer as he talked to them about Martha, about the life he'd thought was over. They listened, Mira with her calm eyes, Lark with his playful energy, Pip with his gentle nuzzles, and Henry felt the hollow in his chest fill not with grief, but with something softer, something alive. One evening, as the fire burned low, Henry sat with them, Mira at his side, the puppies sprawled across his lap. "Reckon you're staying," he murmured, his voice quiet but sure. The snow hadn't melted, not fully, but he didn't care anymore. They were his now, these strays who'd found him, who'd brought joy where he'd thought none could grow. He stroked Mira's fur, felt Lark's snores, Pip's warmth, and smiled. A real steady smile that lingered as the night closed in, warm and peaceful around them. Winter tightened its grip on Willow Hollow, the snow hardening into a crust that gleamed under a weak sun. But inside Henry's cottage, the warmth held steady, a fragile bubble against the cold. The fire burned bright, fed by logs he'd stacked with a care he hadn't shown in years, its glow wrapping Mira, Lark, and Pip. In a circle of light, they'd become his world, the mother dog with her steady brown eyes, the puppies with their boundless energy, and the days had settled into a rhythm that felt like a gift, a quiet joy he'd never thought to find again. But beneath that joy, something else stirred, a shadow he couldn't outrun. Henry sat in his armchair, Martha's shawl draped over his shoulders, his hands resting on the arms as he watched Lark chase a ball of yarn across the floor. Pip toddled after, his tan fur fluffed from a recent tumble, and Mira lay by Henry's feet, her head on his slippers, her tail wagging softly as she tracked her pups. He smiled, a small crooked thing that had grown familiar, but it faltered as a cough rattled through him, dry and sharp, cutting the quiet like a blade. He pressed a hand to his chest, wincing, and Mira lifted her head, her ears twitching, her gaze locking onto his with a worry he couldn't miss. "Just the cold," he muttered, waving a hand as if to dismiss it, but the cough came again, deeper this time, and his breath hitched, short and ragged. He leaned back, closing his eyes, willing it away, but the ache lingered, a dull thud in his ribs, a weight that hadn't been there before. He was old, he knew that. 78 winters had worn him thin, but this was different, a creeping shadow that matched the tremble in his hands, the way his legs wobbled more each day. The doctor's words from months back echoed, unheeded then. "Take care, Henry, your heart's not what it was." He opened his eyes, and there they were, Mira, Lark, and Pip, still watching him, their play paused. Lark dropped the yarn, his grey ears perked, and Pip toddled closer, nuzzling Henry's shin with a soft whimper. Mira rose, pressing her nose to his knee, her warmth seeping through his trousers, and Henry felt a pang, not just the ache in his chest, but something deeper, sharper. They needed him, these three, and he'd let them in, let them fill the hollow where Martha used to be. But now, as the cough rattled again, he saw the truth. He might not be here much longer to give them what they'd given him. "Stop fussin'," he rasped, his voice gruff but trembling, and reached down to stroke Mira's head, his fingers shaky against her fur. She didn't move, just leaned into his touch, her eyes steady, trusting, and the puppies climbed into his lap, their small bodies warm and heavy. He held them there, Lark's wiry fur tickling his palm, Pip's soft snores a faint comfort, and tried to push the fear down, but it clawed back, a cold grip around his heart. What would happen to them? If he couldn't haul wood, couldn't warm broth, couldn't keep the fire going. They were stronger now, yes, but still so small, still so tied to him. The day wore on and the decline sharpened. He stood to stoke the fire, but his legs buckled, sending him stumbling against the chair, the poker clattering to the floor. Mira barked, a sharp, urgent sound, and darted to his side, nudging him as he sank back, his breath coming in gasps. Lark and Pip whimpered, pressing close, their tails still, and Henry gripped the armrest, his vision blurring. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice a wheeze, but the lie tasted bitter, and Mira's whine cut through it, low and mournful, as if she knew. He stayed there, the fire crackling, the cottage quiet save for their worried sounds. The tremble in his hands worsened, spilling the broth he tried to pour later, and the cough returned at night, racking him until his ribs ached. Mira slept closer now, her body pressed against his chair, her head on his lap when he sat. while Lark and Pip curled at his feet, their play subdued. Henry watched them, his chest tight, not just from the cough but from the weight of what he couldn't say. He was failing them, these strays who'd saved him, and the thought tore at him worse than the grief ever had. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the snow outside in hues of pink and gold, Henry sat with them, his breathing shallow, his hands too weak to lift the yarn. Lark nosed it toward him, a hopeful bark, but Henry couldn't bend, couldn't play. "Not tonight, little man," he murmured, and Lark whimpered, climbing into his lap instead, Pip following. Mira rested her chin on his knee, her eyes glinting. In the firelight, and Henry felt the tears come, slow, silent, tracing lines down his weathered face. "You've been good to me," he said, his voice breaking, softer than the wind that whispered outside. "Better than I deserve." He stroked Mira's fur, felt the puppy's warmth, and the fear surged again. What would they do without him? The cottage, the fire, the food. He'd made it theirs, but his body was giving out, a clock winding down he couldn't stop. He coughed again, a wet, painful sound, and Mira pressed closer, her nose cold against his hand, her whine a plea he couldn't answer. The night deepened, and Henry stayed there, the fire burning low, the strays huddled around him. His heart thudded, slow and uneven, and he knew it in the ache, the shortness of breath, the way his strength slipped away. He wasn't just tired, he was fading, and the realization brought the stress back, sharp and cold, clashing with the warmth they'd given him. "I can't leave you," he whispered, his hand resting on Mira's head, the puppy's snores a faint anchor. "Not yet." But as the fire dimmed, casting long shadows across the room, Henry felt the truth settle. He might not have a choice. They'd changed him, these three, pulled him from the dark with their barks and nuzzles, their trust. But now he worried for them, his final days shadowed by the fear of what came next. Mira looked up at him, her eyes steady, and Henry held her gaze, his tears falling into her fur, a silent vow to hold on as long as he could, for them, for the family they'd become. The cottage lay hushed under a twilight sky, the snow outside, glowing faintly purple as the last light bled from the horizon. Inside, the fire burned low, its embers casting a dim, flickering warmth that barely reached the corners of the room. Henry sat slumped in his armchair, Martha's shawl a crumpled weight across his chest, his breath coming in shallow rasps that rattled like dry leaves in the wind. The cough had worsened, a persistent ache that gripped his lungs, and his hands trembled too much to stoke the fire, too weak to lift the bowl of broth he'd meant to warm. Time was slipping, a thread unraveling faster than he could grasp. But he wasn't alone, not anymore. Mira lay pressed against his legs, her brown eyes fixed on him, her head resting heavy on his knee as if anchoring him to the moment. Lark and Pip curled at his feet, their small bodies tucked close, their usual play silenced by the stillness that hung over the room. The puppy's fur, Lark's wiry grey, Pip's soft tan, brushed his slippers, a faint comfort against the cold creeping into his bones. They knew somehow, Mira with her steady gaze, the pups with their quiet whimpers, that something was wrong, and their closeness was a lifeline Henry clung to, even as his strength faded. He coughed again, a wet, painful sound that bent him forward, and Mira whined, low and mournful, nudging his hand with her nose. "Easy, girl," he rasped, his voice a thread, but the effort cost him, leaving him gasping, his chest tight. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and felt the fear rise, a cold, sharp thing that twisted around the love he'd found with them. He'd worried for days, weeks, as his body faltered. What would happen to them when he was gone? The cottage, the fire, the food? They were his to give, and he was failing, a promise he couldn't keep breaking under the weight of his decline. But tonight was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, and Henry knew it in the ache, the shortness of breath, the way his heart stuttered like a candle about to gutter out. This wasn't just a bad spell. It was the end, creeping closer with every labored inhale. He opened his eyes, blinking through the blur of tears, and looked at them. Mira, Lark, Pip, his strays, his family. They'd changed him, pulled him, from the dark with their barks and nuzzles, their trust. And now he faced the truth. He couldn't fight this, couldn't hold on much longer. But he could give them something, one last thing, before the night took him. He shifted, slow and careful, his trembling hand reaching for Mira's head. She pressed into his touch, her fur warm under his fingers, and he stroked her, a shaky rhythm that steadied his breath. "You're a good one," he whispered, his voice cracking, soft as the embers glow. "Kept 'em safe, didn't you?" Lark stirred, climbing into his lap with a soft yip, and Pip followed, their weight a familiar ache against his frail frame. Henry held them there, his arms trembling but sure, and felt the tears spill, hot and silent, down his cheeks. "I ain't got much left," he said, his gaze moving between them. Mira's deep eyes, the puppy's trusting stares. "But you've got each other." The words caught, a sob breaking free, and he tightened his grip, pulling them closer. "I brought you in, gave you what I could, but I can't stay." Mira whined again, her nose brushing his wrist, and Henry smiled through the tears, a small broken thing that lit his face with a peace he hadn't felt since Martha. He leaned down, his forehead resting against Mira's, her warmth a balm against the cold in his chest. "You'll be all right, my dears," he whispered, his voice a vow, a promise carved into the quiet. "You're strong, Mira, you'll keep 'em safe, like you did out there. Lark, Pip, you'll grow, you'll run, you'll be okay." He pulled back, meeting her gaze, and saw something there, understanding maybe, or just love, steady and unshaken. "You don't need me no more, you've got this." The fire popped, a spark flaring briefly, and Henry felt the weight lift. Not pain, not the weakness, but the fear. He'd worried for them, let it gnaw at him as his body failed, but now in this moment he saw it clear. They were a family, not just because of him, but because of each other. Mira's strength, the puppy's spirit, they'd survive, they'd thrive, and that was enough. He'd given them a start, a shelter from the storm, and they'd given him a reason to live these final days, a joy he'd thought was lost forever. He sank back, his breath slowing, the puppies nestled against his chest, Mira's head heavy. On his lap. "Martha'd be proud," he murmured, his eyes drifting to the photo on the mantel, her smile, her hazel eyes, watching over them. "She'd say you're ours, all of you." He coughed again, softer now, and felt the room blur, the edges softening as the fire dimmed. Mira pressed closer, her whine fading to a sigh, and Lark and Pip snuggled tighter, their warmth a heartbeat against his own. The night deepened, the cottage still, save for the faint crackle of the embers and the strays breathing. Henry's hand rested on Mira's head, his fingers still in her fur, and he smiled, a real steady smile that lingered as his eyes closed. "You'll be all right," he whispered again, a final promise that hung in the air, a thread of love tying them together. The fear was gone, replaced by a peace he hadn't known he could find, not just for him but for them, his family, who'd changed his final days into something beautiful. He drifted, the pain easing, the cold retreating, and felt them there. Mira, Lark, Pip, their warmth holding him as the dark came soft and quiet. The fire burned low, the snow glowed outside, and Henry let go, his promise a light that stayed with them, a vow that whatever came next, they'd face it together, just as they'd faced everything else. The night wrapped Henry's cottage in, a stillness deeper than any storm, the snow outside glowing faintly under a crescent moon that hung low over Willow Hollow. Inside, the fire had burned to a whisper, its embers a soft red pulse that cast long shadows across the room. Henry sat in his armchair, his head tilted back, Martha's shawl a gentle weight across his chest, his hands still, one resting on Mira's head, the other cradling Lark and Pip against him. His breath had slowed, a faint rise and fall that matched the rhythm of the dog's snores until it didn't. The quiet came soft and final, a hush that settled over him like a blanket, and Henry slipped away, his smile lingering, peaceful, surrounded by the family he'd found in his last days. Mira lay pressed against his legs, her brown eyes half closed, her head heavy on his knee, as if she'd felt the shift but refused to let go. Lark and Pip nestled in his lap, their tiny bodies warm and still. their fur, Lark's wiry grey, Pip's soft tan, brushing his fingers in a silent farewell. The cottage held its breath, the fire's last crackle fading into silence. And they stayed there, a tableau of love carved into the night. Henry, the old man who'd opened his door, and the strays who'd opened his heart. The cold couldn't touch them now, not in this moment, not with the warmth they'd built together. Time drifted, the hours unmarked by the clock's ticking or the wind's whisper. The embers dimmed, the room cooling, but Mira didn't move, her nose tucked against Henry's hand, her tail still. Lark stirred once, a sleepy yip muffled against his brother, and Pip sighed, nuzzling deeper into Henry's lap, their trust unbroken even as the life they'd clung to slipped away. They slept, or seemed to, a vigil they didn't know they kept, their presence a testament to the days they'd shared, the meals, the play, the stories by the fire. Henry had promised they'd be all right, and in his passing that promise held them close, a bond that death couldn't sever. Morning broke slow and grey, the snow outside crunching under boots as a figure approached the cottage. Tom Hargrove, a neighbour who'd once brought casseroles Henry never ate, had noticed the chimney's silence. No smoke curling up, no sign of life in the frost-crusted windows. He'd worried, off and on, about the old man who'd shut the world out, and, now with the storm long past, something tugged at him to check. He knocked, a sharp rap that echoed unanswered, and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking into the stillness. The cold hit him first, the fire long dead, but it was the sight that stopped him. Henry in his chair, still as stone, his face soft with a smile Tom hadn't seen in years. Mira lifted her head, her eyes glinting in the dim light, and let out a low whine, her tail giving a faint wag as if to say he'd been expected. Lark and Pip stirred, their barks small and sleepy, and climbed from Henry's lap to totter toward Tom, their paws pattering on the floor. "Lord above," Tom muttered, his breath fogging as he stepped inside, his hat clutched in his hands. He's gone. He knelt beside the chair, his rough fingers brushing Henry's wrist. No pulse, just the chill of a body left too long, without breath. Mira pressed against him, nudging his hand, and Tom stroked her fur, his throat tight. "You stayed with him, didn't you, girl?" he said, his voice thick. He looked at the puppies, Lark sniffing his boots, Pip wagging his tail, and saw the blanket, the empty bowl, the signs of care Henry had poured into them. "He wasn't alone," Tom murmured, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. "Not at the end." Tom stood, his knees creaking, and glanced around. The photo of Martha on the mantel, her smile watching over them, the shawl draped like a last embrace. He'd known Henry before, the gruff widower who'd turned away help. But this was different. The strays had changed him, softened him, given him something to hold on to, and in return, he'd given them a home, a love that lingered in the air even now. "Good man," Tom said, his voice breaking, and Mira whined again, her nose brushing Henry's hand as if urging him to wake. He couldn't leave them there, not like this. Tom stepped outside, the snow crunching under his boots, and fetched a blanket from his truck, a thick wool thing he kept for emergencies. He wrapped Henry gently, lifting him from the chair with a care he hadn't known he'd need, and Mira followed, her pups at her heels, their bark soft but insistent. "Come on, you lot," he said, his voice steadying. "We'll get him sorted." He carried Henry to the truck, laying him in the back, and opened the passenger door for the dogs. Mira leapt in, her pups scrambling after, and Tom drove slow, to town, the silence heavy but warm with their presence. At the church, he told the pastor, Reverend Ellis, a kind man who'd known Henry and Martha from better days. "Found him this morning," Tom said, his hat still in his hands. "These three were with him, didn't leave his side." The Reverend nodded, his eyes soft, and peered at Mira, Lark, and Pip, who sat close, their tails wagging faintly. "They're his then," he said. "We'll see to him, and them." Word spread quick, as it did in Willow Hollow, and soon the village knew. Henry Grayson was gone, but not alone, not forgotten, thanks to the strays who'd stayed. The cottage stood empty that day, the fire cold, the air still, but the echo of their bond remained. Mira's vigil, the puppy's warmth, Henry's final smile. He'd passed quietly, surrounded by love, a stark contrast to the lonely man he'd been, and as the snow glowed under the rising sun, it felt right somehow. They'd healed him, these three, and in his last breath he'd held them close, a family forged in the dark, shining bright even now. The morning sun climbed slow over Willow Hollow, its light piercing the frost that clung to the villages, rooftops casting a gentle glow on the churchyard where Henry Grayson's body rested, awaiting burial. The news of his passing had rippled through the tight-knit community like a stone dropped in still water, carried by Tom Hargrove's quiet words to Reverend Ellis, then whispered over fences and murmured in the feed store. Henry, the gruff widower who'd shut out the world, had died, but not alone, not forgotten. Beside him had been Mira, the stray mother dog, and her puppies, Lark and Pip, their loyalty a story that softened even the hardest hearts in town. Tom stood by his truck outside the church, his hat in his hands, watching as Mira paced near the steps, her brown eyes glinting with a mix of trust and unease. Lark and Pip tumbled after her, their barks small but bright, their tails wagging as they sniffed the snow-dusted grass. "Can't just leave them," Tom muttered, his breath fogging in the crisp air. He'd brought them here, unsure what else to do. The sight of them, still so tied to Henry, stirred something in him, a need to see this through. Reverend Ellis emerged, his coat buttoned tight, and nodded at the trio. "They're his legacy, Tom," he said, his voice warm. "We'll take care of them." Word spread fast, as it always did in Willow Hollow, and by noon the village began to gather. First came Mrs. Carter, the widow who'd once knitted for Martha, her arms full of a quilt, thick and blue, patched with care. She knelt by Mira, draping it over her back, and smiled as the dog leaned into her touch. "Poor dear kept him warm," she said, her voice trembling. "We'll keep you warm now." Lark and Pip nosed the quilt, their paws tangling in its folds, and Mrs. Carter chuckled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she patted their heads. Next was Sam Tully, the blacksmith's boy, barely 16, his hands stuffed with a sack of jerky scraps from his father's shop. "Heard they stayed with him till the end," he said, tossing a piece to Lark, who caught it mid-air with a triumphant bark. Pip toddled over, nipping at his brother's prize, and Sam grinned, spilling more onto the ground. "Reckon they deserve a treat." Mira watched, her tail wagging slow and steady, and Sam scratched her ears, his young face softening with a respect beyond his years. The Reverend called a few men, Tom included, to the churchyard, where Henry's grave would be, a simple plot near the oak he'd once rested under with Martha. "He'd want 'em close," Ellis said, and the men nodded, their boots crunching. Snow as they set to work. They built a shelter, a sturdy lean-to of wood and tin tucked against the tree, its floor lined with straw and Mrs. Carter's quilt. It wasn't much, but it was solid, a haven against the wind, and Tom hammered the last nail with a quiet pride. "They'll be safe here," he said, stepping back, and Mira padded over, sniffing the straw, her pups bounding in behind her. Afternoon more came. Old Mr. Jenkins, who'd known Henry from boyhood, brought a sack of oats. "For their bellies," he grunted, setting it by the shelter. The Miller twins, barely 10, ran up with a ball they'd patched from rags, tossing it for Lark and Pip, who chased it with yips that echoed through the yard. "They're heroes!" one twin shouted, giggling as Pip tumbled into the snow, and Mira barked, a soft woof that seemed to agree. The village women arrived with bowls, broth from their kitchens, bits of meat and bread, and set them near the lean-to, a small feast that Mira lapped at, her tail wagging harder now, her pups diving in beside her. Reverend Ellis stood by the grave, his hands clasped, watching the scene unfold. "Henry was alone till they found him," he said to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying over the chatter. "They gave him something, love, company, a reason to keep going. Now it's our turn." Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement, rippling through, and Tom stepped forward, his voice rough but clear. He weren't much for talking, but he'd have wanted this, wanted 'em looked after. The villagers agreed, a quiet pact forming in the cold air. Mira, Lark and Pip were theirs now, a piece of Henry to hold on to. As dusk fell, the community lingered, their breath fogging in the fading light. The shelter stood ready, the dogs fed and warm, and the Reverend led a short prayer by the grave, Simple words for a simple man, thanking him for the love he'd found, the love he'd left behind. Mira sat close, her head tilted as if listening, while Lark and Pip played. There barks a bright thread in the solemn moment. "Rest easy, Henry," Ellis finished, and the crowd dispersed, leaving promises to check in, to bring food, to keep the fire of Henry's legacy burning. Tom stayed last, kneeling by the lean-to as Mira settled in, her pups curling against her. "You did good by him," he said, his hand resting on her head, her eyes meeting his with that same steady trust she'd given Henry. "We'll do good by you." He stood, brushing snow from his knees, and glanced at the grave, unmarked, yet but soon to bear Henry's name. The dogs were safe, cared for, and Tom felt a weight lift, a sense that Henry's final days had mattered, that his love had rippled out to touch them all. Night settled over Willow Hollow, the churchyard quiet save for the rustle of straw and the soft snores from the shelter. Mira lay with Lark and Pip, her warmth a shield around them, and the village slept, its heart a little fuller for the strays who'd changed one man and, in turn, changed them. Henry was gone, but his bond with them lived on, honored, protected, a testament to the healing power of love that the community now carried forward. Spring crept into Willow Hollow, melting the snow into rivulets that trickled through the churchyard, softening the earth around Henry Grayson's grave. The oak tree stretched its branches wide, budding with new leaves that dappled the ground in green and gold, and beneath it stood the lean-to, sturdy still, its tin roof glinting in the sun. A simple stone marked Henry's resting place, etched with his name and dates, a quiet tribute to a man who'd lived alone but died surrounded by love. Beside it lived Mira, Lark, and Pip, their days unfolding in a rhythm that wove Henry's memory into the fabric of the village. Mira had grown into her strength, her brown and black coat thick and glossy now, her ribs hidden beneath muscle earned from months of care. She lay atop the grave often, her body stretched across the grass, her head resting where Henry's heart would be, as if guarding him still. Her brown eyes glinted with a calm that hadn't left her since that final night, a steady presence that anchored her pups, Lark and Pip. No longer the frail bundles of fur Henry had sheltered, but young dogs now, their legs long and their spirits bright. They'd made the churchyard their home, the lean-to their den, and the village their family, a life built on the love Henry had given them. Lark was the bold one, his grey fur wiry and wild, his barks sharp as he chased squirrels up the oak or darted after the rag ball the Miller twins still brought. He'd leap onto the grave beside Mira, his tail wagging like a metronome, and paw at the stone, a playful salute to the man who'd tossed yarn for him in the cottage. Pip, softer and tan, preferred to linger near Mira, his yips a gentle chime as he nosed the grass or rolled in the sun-warmed dirt, floppy ears flopping with every tumble. They'd play, their energy spilling across the yard, and Mira would watch, her tail thumping a slow beat, a mother's pride in her eyes. The village kept them close. Tom Hargrove came daily, his boots crunching the path, a sack of scraps, bones, bread, whatever he could spare, slung over his shoulder. "Mornin', you lot," he'd say, setting the food by the lean-to, and Mira would wag her tail, a quiet thanks, while Lark and Pip bounded over, their barks a chorus of welcome. Mrs. Carter stopped by with new blankets when the old ones frayed, her hands trembling as she tucked them in, her voice soft. "Henry'd be glad you're still here." The Miller twins raced through after school, their laughter ringing as they played fetch, the ball sailing over the grass while Mira barked, joining in with a woof that echoed her days with Henry. Seasons turned, and their life grew roots. Summer brought heat, and they'd sprawl in the shade of the oak, Mira's tongue lolling as Lark and Pip wrestled, their paws kicking up dust. Autumn painted the leaves red and gold, and they'd chase them, Lark leaping high, Pip tumbling low, while Mira rested on the grave, her eyes half closed, her warmth seeping into the earth. Winter returned softer this time, and the village built a fire pit near the lean-to, Tom tending it on cold nights, while Mira curled around her pups, their breaths fogging in the crisp air. They thrived, strong, loved, a living echo of Henry's final days. The grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Villagers passing by would pause, tipping hats or nodding, their voices low with stories of the old man and his strays. He weren't the same after Martha, they'd say, but them dogs, they brought him back least for a while. Children, drawn by the puppy's play, would linger, their small hands stroking Mira's fur, their giggles blending with Lark's barks and Pip's yips. They're Henry's dogs, the Miller twins would boast, and Mira would wag her tail as if agreeing, her presence a bridge between the man gone and the life he'd left behind. One spring evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the churchyard, Tom sat by the lean-to, a rare stillness in his rough hands. Mira lay beside him, her head on the grave. Lark and Pip sprawled in the grass, chewing sticks from the oak. "You're doing all right, ain't you?" he murmured, scratching Mira's ears, her eyes glinting in the fading light. She nudged, his hand a cold nose against his palm, and Tom smiled, a crooked, tender thing that mirrored Henry's last one. He'd be proud, seeing you here, growing strong. The night settled, stars pricking the sky, and Mira rose, stretching, her legs before lying back on the grave, her pups curling against her. The lean-to stood close, its straw rustling as the wind whispered through and the fire pit glowed faintly, a warmth that held the cold at bay. They slept, Lark's snores sharp, Pip's soft, Mira's breath steady, and the churchyard hushed, a sanctuary of their making. Henry was gone, his body beneath the stone, but he lived in them, in the wag of their tails, the patter of their paws, the love they carried forward. Days became months, months stretched toward years, and still they stayed. The village watched them grow, Lark into a lanky hunter, Pip into a gentle shadow, Mira into a matriarch whose eyes held Henry's memory. They played in the sun, rested in the shade, guarded the grave through every season, their lives a testament to the bond that had saved a lonely man and in turn saved them. The lean-to weathered, the stone mossed over, but their presence remained, a quiet living tribute that warmed Willow Hollow's heart. As twilight fell one day, Mira lifted her head, her gaze distant as if hearing a voice in the wind. Henry's, perhaps, or Martha's calling from beyond. Lark and Pip pressed close, their warmth a circle around her, and she sighed, a sound of peace that settled over the grave. They were home here with him, and as the stars blinked on, they slept, a family unbroken, their love a light that shone through time. Summer bloomed over Willow Hollow, the churchyard awash in wildflowers that nodded under a lazy sun, their colors a soft frame around Henry Grayson's grave. The oak tree stood tall, its leaves whispering in the breeze, and beneath it the lean-to sheltered Mira, Lark, and Pip, their lives a quiet rhythm woven into the village's days. Years had passed since Henry's passing, the snow of that first. Winter a distant memory, but his stone, mossed and weathered, remained, a silent anchor for the dogs who'd made it their home. Mira, her coat silvered at the muzzle, lay atop the grave, her brown eyes half closed, while Lark and Pip, grown into strong young dogs, sprawled nearby, their tails wagging faintly in the heat. The sound of laughter broke the stillness, high and bright, as a gaggle of children scampered into the churchyard, their bare feet kicking up dust. The Miller twins, older now, their voices cracking with adolescence, led the pack, a woven basket. Swinging between them, "Come on, they're waiting," one shouted, and the others followed, a trail of giggles and chatter that stirred Mira's ears. She lifted her head, her tail thumping a slow welcome, and Lark barked, leaping to his feet, his grey fur glinting as he bounded toward them. Pip followed, his tan coat soft in the sunlight, his yips a gentle echo of his puppy days. The children gathered by the lean-to, their hands full of treasures, wildflowers picked from the fields, scraps of bread from their lunches, a bone Tom Hargrove had sent along. Ellie, a girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin, knelt by Mira, setting a daisy chain atop her head. "You're the queen today," she said, giggling as Mira nosed her hand, her eyes warm with a trust that spanned years. Lark snatched the bone, darting off with a triumphant woof, and Pip rolled in the grass, letting the twins scratch his belly as they laughed. The scene was alive, dogs and children, sun and flowers, a tapestry of joy that filled the yard with light. "Tell us the story," A small boy with freckles piped up, plopping down by the grave, his eyes wide. The twins grinned, settling beside him, and Ellie took the lead, her voice clear as she began. "It was a cold, snowy night," she said, her hands waving for effect. "And old man Henry was all alone in his cottage, sad because his wife was gone." The children leaned in, their chatter fading, and Mira tilted her head, as if listening too. Then Mira scratched at his door. She was skinny and cold, with Lark and Pip so tiny they could hardly walk. Henry didn't want them at first, but he let them in, and they stayed. He fed them broth and played with them, one twin added, tossing a flower at Lark, who caught it mid-air. And they made him smile again even when he was sick. The freckled boy nodded, hugging his knees. "They stayed with him when he died, right there in his chair," he said, pointing at the grave. "Didn't leave him, not once." Pip yipped, rolling closer, and Ellie scratched his ears, her voice softening. "After, the village took care of them, built this house, brought food, 'cause they were Henry's dogs, and he loved them." The story flowed, a tale polished by years of telling. How Mira's strength, Lark's spirit, and Pip's gentleness had healed a lonely man. How their loyalty had touched a town. The children added their own flourishes. Lark chasing shadows, Pip sleeping in Henry's lap, Mira guarding him through the night. And Mira watched, her tail wagging slow and steady, a queen indeed in their eyes. They finished with the lean-to, the fire pit, the village's vow, and the freckled boy grinned. "They're still here, see, right where Henry is." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and the children scattered flowers over the grave, a colorful crown for the stone. "For Henry," Ellie said, and the others echoed, "For Henry," their voices a chorus of love. Lark dropped the bone by the lean-to, flopping beside Mira, and Pip nestled close, his snores a soft hum as the kids sat back, their faces glowing with the tale. Tom Hargrove approached, his boots slow on the path, and paused, his hat in his hands, a smile tugging at his lips. "Still telling it, huh?" he said, and Ellie nodded, beaming. "It's the best story, Mr. Tom." He knelt by Mira, stroking her silvered fur, and looked at the grave, the dogs, the children. "Aye, it is," he said, his voice rough but warm. "He was alone till they came, changed his final days, gave him something to hold on to, and you lot, you keep it alive." The twins grinned, tossing the rag ball for Lark, who bounded after it, and Pip wagged his tail, nuzzling Tom's hand. "They're ours now," Ellie said, and Tom nodded, a tear glinting in his eye. "Always will be." The evening settled, the children drifting home with promises to return, leaving the churchyard quiet save for the rustle of leaves and the dogs' steady breaths. Mira lay back on the grave, her pups curled against her, the flowers a soft blanket around them. The stars blinked on, a canopy over their small world, and they slept. Lark's snores sharp, Pip's soft, Mira's a steady hymn to the man beneath the stone. Henry was gone, but his love lived in them, in the village, in the stories told by wide-eyed kids, a legacy of healing that warmed Willow Hollow's heart. And that was the truth of it. A stray mother dog and her puppies had knocked on a lonely man's door, seeking shelter, and found a home that changed them all. Henry's final days had glowed with their love, a light that eased his grief, his stress, and in return, he'd given them a life that endured. The moral shone clear, simple and sweet. Love can find you when you least expect it, heal you when you're broken, and live on when you're gone, a gift from the smallest hearts to the widest world. The night deepened, the churchyard hushed, and Mira rested her chin over Lark and Pip, her eyes closing as the breeze carried their tail into the stars. They were together, always, forever, a family forged in a storm, shining bright in the quiet, a heartwarming end to a story that would never fade.